15 years. 15 years of weekends spent in that garage. 15 years hearing Gerald's gentle humming as he scrubbed metal components with a worn-out toothbrush. 15 years observing his hands, growing more wrinkled with time, tenderly handling each bolt, each cable, each section of that 1967 Mustang like it was alive. The vacant garage struck me like a sharp blow. I remained rooted at the entrance, shopping bags dangling from my fingers, struggling to comprehend what lay before me. The area that had served as Gerald's haven for so long, and following his passing, my final spot to sense his nearness, now consisted only of stark concrete and faded patches on the walls where equipment had once been mounted. Andrew. My tone came out odd, overly shrill, as I let the bags fall and stepped into the middle of the barren garage. Andrew. I located my son in the kitchen, examining documents with the casual air of someone sorting routine grocery slips, not the person who had wiped away the final physical remnant of his dad. "Where's your dad's car?" I questioned, my fingers shaking. Andrew hardly glanced up from his files. At 45, he looked so much like Gerald in appearance and so unlike him in temperament that gazing at him occasionally caused pain. "Sold it earlier today," he answered, as though discussing the forecast. "A enthusiast acquired it for a solid amount." "You sold it." The phrase stuck in my windpipe. "How could you do that?" "It belonged to your dad." Andrew lifted his shoulders in a relaxed motion that sparked a raw fury within me. Wendy wished to convert the garage into a wardrobe area, he clarified, going back to his paperwork. She required room for her wardrobe changes by season. "Anyway, Mom, that vehicle was simply gathering grime. You aren't even familiar with operating it." Wendy, naturally, my son's wife, the home decorator who viewed our simple residence as a makeover opportunity, not the dwelling where Gerald and I had created a lifetime spanning almost 5 decades. "That vehicle meant the world to your dad," I stated, fighting to stay composed. "He poured his remaining time into reviving it." "It was merely an item, Mom." Andrew at last met my gaze with that patronizing look he'd mastered since his teen years. "Dad's no longer here. The vehicle can't restore him. I'm his rightful successor. And I chose a practical economic option. 71 years on this earth hadn't readied me for this instant. To realize that my own child failed to grasp that the Mustang represented more than steel and fuel. It embodied every weekend Gerald devoted to it amid his battle with cancer. It captured the resolve to complete one final endeavor before his strength gave out. It was the sole location where I could still settle and inhale his aroma, lubricant, alloy, and that cologne he'd worn for 4 decades. Yet I couldn't summon the phrases to convey all this to Andrew. We'd never communicated in the same way, my son and me. Gerald had acted as our interpreter, the link between my heartfelt affection and Andrew's stark realism. "You might have at least asked my opinion," was the only thing I managed to utter. "It would have led to an avoidably sentimental discussion," Andrew responded, putting his signature on the last form. "Wendy and I figured this approach would be simpler for you, similar to yanking off a plaster quickly." I exited the kitchen before uttering something irreversible. I went back to the empty garage, experiencing a kind of dizziness while staring at the cleared-out area. In that instance, with the late afternoon glow streaming through the lone window, I sensed more bereft than at any point, as though I'd forfeited Gerald once more. I'm uncertain how long I lingered there on the chilly floor when the landline sounded. I ignored it. Then it persisted, ringing repeatedly. At last, I caught Andrew's voice picking up. Moments afterward, he emerged at the garage threshold with a peculiar look. "It's for you," he announced, offering the wireless handset. "A guy called Carlos from Premium Classics, the place that purchased the Mustang." I accepted the device warily. "Hello, Mrs. Thompson. This is Carlos Mendoza from Premium Classics." The speaker on the line conveyed deference, nearly awe. "Your spouse stashed something within the Mustang's cushion. You ought to come immediately." "My spouse," I echoed, perplexed. "My spouse died 3 years back." "I understand, ma'am," Carlos answered. "And I extend my deepest condolences. Gerald was a genuine artisan. But this matters greatly. We uncovered a concealed section beneath the operator's cushion. There's a container labeled with your name. Please arrive soon." I glanced at Andrew, who had overheard sufficient to display a hint of intrigue at last. "I'll head over promptly," I responded, sensing a flicker of optimism for the first time in hours. The trip to the establishment was quiet. Andrew demanded to transport me, maybe from remorse, maybe from interest. We stayed silent. I gazed through the glass, pondering what Gerald could have concealed in that secret spot, a misplaced implement, some paperwork. Upon reaching Premium Classics, the Mustang shone beneath the facility's illumination, more stunning than before. My chest tightened at the sight, aware it was no longer mine, no longer ours. Carlos Mendoza proved to be a man in his middle years with roughened palms and compassionate gaze. He welcomed me with a reverence that starkly differed from my son's apathy. "Mrs. Thompson," he uttered, clasping my hand. "It's a privilege to encounter you. Your spouse frequently mentioned you." "You were acquainted with Gerald?" I inquired, taken aback. Carlos grinned. "We shared camaraderie. We both cherished vintage models," he elaborated, directing me to the Mustang. "When we discovered this, I instantly recognized I needed to contact you." He bent into the vehicle and lifted out the operator's cushion with unexpected simplicity, exposing a flawlessly built niche in the foundation. From there, he retrieved a timber container intricately etched with flower patterns. "This belongs to you, ma'am," Carlos declared, presenting it to me cautiously. "Gerald informed me that one day it would reach you. It appears today is that occasion." I grasped the container, sensing its substantial mass, identifying the engraved blooms as my preferred ones, daisies and lilies, and the precise craftsmanship of Gerald's touch. And in that instant, as I cradled that container in a showroom scented with fresh rubber and commercial deodorizer, I perceived my husband's essence nearer than during the 3 years since he left. "There's an additional item," Carlos appended, casting a quick look at Andrew, who observed the occurrence with an unreadable demeanor. "But I believe you should view it privately after examining the container." "An additional item?" I repeated, holding the timber container to my torso. Carlos affirmed with a nod, his manner kind yet reserved. "If you'd care to accompany me to my workspace, Mrs. Thompson, it's more secluded." I peeked at Andrew, who was inspecting the Mustang with fresh attention, as if perceiving it correctly for the initial time. "I'll remain here," he stated, avoiding my gaze. Maybe remorse was at last piercing his logical exterior. Carlos escorted me through an entrance labeled private into a compact workspace cluttered with car periodicals, old promotional signs, and mounted images of antique automobiles. He drew out a seat for me, then positioned himself across the desk. "Your spouse and I connected at an auto exhibition roughly 10 years prior," he described, interlacing his seasoned fingers on the surface. "We connected through our enthusiasm for U.S. icons. When his well-being started deteriorating, he came to me with a unique plea." My digits followed the sculpted blooms on the container resting in my lap. "Lilies and daisies," Gerald had recalled. After 47 years wed, he still remembered the flowers I'd held at our ceremony. "What sort of plea?" I queried. Carlos delved into his desk compartment and extracted a slim packet. "Gerald requested I safeguard something for you. He mentioned that if the moment arrived when the Mustang was disposed of, and he was quite sure it would, I was to deliver this to you alongside the container he'd hidden in the vehicle." He passed me the packet. My name appeared on the front in Gerald's unique script, tilted somewhat rightward, with a graceful loop on the uppercase M in Margaret. Merely viewing those recognizable ink marks formed a knot in my throat. "I'll provide you some solitude," Carlos murmured softly, standing from his seat. "Use as much time as necessary." Once the door shut after him, I remained still for a few instants, gazing at the packet and the container. These ultimate fragments of Gerald, unforeseen presence from the afterlife, appeared almost too valuable to unveil, as if piercing the seal would mark the genuine conclusion of our tale. At length, I delicately unsealed the packet, unfolding a solitary page filled with Gerald's script. "My beloved Margaret, if this reaches your eyes, 2 events have transpired. I've departed this realm, and Andrew has disposed of the Mustang. I'm not resentful of either. Mortality visits everyone, and Andrew never embraced our fondness for items possessing essence and heritage. The container holds my experience with the Mustang, snapshots, annotations, and reflections I noted during the process. But crucially, it includes something for your path ahead. I realize you're furious currently, wounded that our child could discard an item that signified so much to us. But kindly recall that Andrew perceives existence differently from us. He notices utility, not significance. Productivity, not spirit. It's not a defect in his nature. It's merely his essence. Now, regarding the additional item Carlos referenced, kindly return to the display area when prepared. Your actual astonishment is there. It's the genuine "'cause I'm content with the Mustang gaining a fresh abode." Recall our discussions about embarking on that nationwide drive? How you mentioned one day we'd witness the Grand Canyon during dusk and the redwoods at daybreak. That day has come, my dear. It's your moment to display courage. Eternally yours, Gerald. I held the message to my core, tears streaming unchecked now. Even from the grave, Gerald comprehended precisely my emotions. How had he foreseen with such assurance that Andrew would sell the vehicle? And what astonishment could possibly alleviate the agony of losing this final concrete piece of him? With unsteady hands, I ultimately opened the timber container. Within, as Gerald's message had assured, rested a precisely arranged assortment, a hide-covered diary packed with thorough records on every element of the Mustang's revival. Images chronicling the progression from the moment he'd acquired the corroded frame to the lustrous, completed item. Minor drawings of components he'd crafted personally when originals were unavailable. But below these, in a distinct section, I uncovered monetary records, asset reports, banking details, and official documents, all under my name. Gerald had discreetly accumulated investments over the years, amassing a considerable reserve I'd been unaware of. A slip attached to these papers stated plainly, "For your explorations, my dear. No more postponements." After studying myself as much as possible, I collected the container and message and re-entered the display area. Andrew was still scrutinizing the Mustang, sliding his palm along its buffed bonnet with a look I couldn't fully interpret. Carlos positioned himself near the primary counter, conversing softly with a younger individual. Upon noticing me, he beamed and motioned for me to approach. "Mrs. Thompson, prepared for the latter portion of Gerald's astonishment?" I affirmed with a nod, incapable of forming terms around the feeling blocking my throat. "Accompany me," he directed, guiding me to a rear entrance of the display area. Andrew followed, his inquisitiveness evidently surpassing his prior aloofness. The entrance revealed a smaller exhibition space, brightly illuminated and holding only one automobile, a streamlined silver Audi A3 adorned with a big crimson ribbon on the front. "This," Carlos proclaimed with clear delight, "belongs to you, Mrs. Thompson," completely settled by Gerald 3 years prior with directions to store it securely until the Mustang was sold. I gaped at the automobile in astonishment. It was elegant, contemporary, and entirely unlike the bulky vintage vehicles Gerald had adored. "I don't comprehend," I murmured. Carlos presented me with a key device. "Gerald indicated you required something with automatic shifting, simple to maneuver with all current protective elements, something to instill assurance on the streets." He grinned tenderly. He stated, and I repeat, Margaret has lived her entire existence being careful. It's time she embarked on an escapade. Andrew advanced, his face blending shock and what could have been esteem. "Dad acquired a car for you, but you don't operate vehicles." "I possess my permit," I answered softly. "I simply haven't driven for years. Not since the highway scared me that occasion we returned from your university ceremony." Carlos swung open the operator's door. "There's one further item within," he mentioned. On the companion's seat rested a sizable packet and a fresh navigation tool. I unsealed the packet to discover a thoroughly organized travel plan with charts, lodging bookings, and emphasized points of interest, creating a vast circuit across the nation. All the locations Gerald and I had dreamed of exploring one day. At the head of the initial sheet in Gerald's script, the voyage of 1,000 miles starts with a single twist of the ignition. "Show courage, my Margaret." For the first time that day, I experienced something surpassing sorrow and rage, a faint glimmer of opportunity. He organized all this? Andrew inquired, looking over my shoulder at the charts. Your dad, I uttered gently, tracing my fingers over the hide wheel. Always considered every aspect. Care to settle in it? Carlos suggested, indicating the operator's position. I wavered, abruptly feeling like a young person presented with her initial glimpse of autonomy. The Audi sparkled under the exhibition lights, refined and a bit daunting, with its advanced panel crammed with controls and displays I didn't know. I started, then halted, Gerald's phrases resounding in my thoughts. Show courage, my Margaret. With a profound inhalation, I moved ahead and gingerly eased into the operator's spot. The hide was soft and cozy, conforming to my shape as if tailored for me. The wheel felt sleek under my digits, and the panel, though daunting at first, appeared logically organized. Everything was conveniently accessible. Gerald picked this version deliberately, Carlos clarified, bending to highlight functions. Automatic gearing, naturally. Outstanding protection evaluations. The reverse view shows everything rearward on this display, and the guidance system is already set with the whole path he designed for you. Andrew walked around the automobile, his face inscrutable. This is a major acquisition, he commented, slipping back to his professional demeanor. Premium, recent edition. What state is the motor in after being idle for 3 years? Immaculate state, Carlos answered with expert assurance. We've serviced it every month. Lubricant replacements, power source upkeep, even operated it around the area routinely to maintain all systems functional. Gerald covered a full maintenance agreement. Naturally he did, Andrew grumbled, but a fresh note colored his tone. Not fully admiration, but maybe an emerging awareness of his dad's foresight depths. I glided my hands over the wheel, attempting to absorb the actuality of this present. For decades, I'd been the rider in our union, not because Gerald controlled things, but because I favored it that way. He'd forever been the explorer, the chance-taker, while I supplied the steady base from which he could venture. The notion of switching those positions was both frightening and oddly thrilling. There's a card for a driving coach in the storage compartment, Carlos went on. Gerald set up refresher sessions tailored for experienced operators. The initial 10 meetings are prepaid. I accessed the storage compartment and discovered not only the coach's card, but a compact hide-covered booklet embossed with Road Voyage Diary on the front. Inside, the opening page held another message from Gerald. Document what you observe, my dear. The world appears altered from the operator's position. I lack words, I murmured, shutting the booklet and pressing it to my chest. Say you'll operate it, arrived Andrew's surprising reply. I glanced up to see my son regarding me with a look I hadn't witnessed since his youth. A blend of doubt and anticipation. Dad clearly desired this for you. I'm unsure if I'm able, I confessed. It's been ages since I've driven farther than the market, and even then in our aged wagon. That's the reason he organized the sessions, Carlos remarked kindly. Gerald informed me you were always more valiant than you acknowledged. I wasn't certain of that. The idea of joining freeways, maneuvering unknown metropolises, deciding from behind the wheel, it all appeared daunting. But then, I'd never envisioned enduring without Gerald either. And somehow I'd coped for 3 years alone. Might I attempt it just circling the area? I asked hesitantly. Carlos radiated. Certainly. Allow me to fetch the interim registration forms and we can test it now. As Carlos assembled the required papers, I acquainted myself with the automobile's interior, shifting the seat and reflectors to suit my stature. Andrew loitered uneasily by the companion entrance. Would you care to join? I inquired, astonished by my own offer. He paused, glancing at his timepiece, a practice so evocative of his dad that my heart squeezed. But unlike Gerald, who noted time to cherish each instant, Andrew perpetually appeared to compute how swiftly he could advance to the subsequent duty. I ought to contact Wendy, he mentioned. Inform her we'll be late. Of course, I endeavored to conceal the letdown in my voice. To my astonishment, following a short exchange with his spouse, Andrew opened the companion door and settled next to me. She advises taking our time, he clarified, though his look implied the discussion hadn't been entirely that straightforward. Carlos came back with the documents and a provisional tag. All is arranged. The automobile is formally yours, Mrs. Thompson. He gave me a binder of files. Ownership, coverage, all up to date and in your name. Gerald anticipated everything. He always did, I whispered. With Carlos's urging, I activated the button ignition. The motor awakened with a soft hum, nothing resembling the deep rumble of Gerald's Mustang, but comforting in its subdued performance. The panel lit up, and the guidance screen showed a cheerful, "Welcome, Margaret." "He even entered your name in it," Andrew noted, something akin to real wonder in his tone. Adhering to Carlos's patient directions, I shifted the automobile into motion and cautiously exited the exhibition space into the afternoon rays. The handling was reactive yet lenient, the stops fluid and reliable. As we looped the area, I sensed an odd feeling growing in my chest. Not fully assurance yet, but maybe it's forerunner, potential. "You're performing wonderfully, Mom," Andrew commented as I adeptly managed a curve. The basic praise, so uncommon from my ever-critical son, almost prompted tears. Upon returning to the establishment, Carlos awaited with an endorsing grin. How did it seem? Like, I hunted for the appropriate terms. Like, Gerald continues to instruct me fresh lessons. That's precisely what he wished for. Carlos assisted me out of the automobile. "The driving coach can commence tomorrow if you desire." Gerald proposed, starting with calm residential paths and slowly advancing to major roads. I nodded, swamped by both appreciation and apprehension. The truth of what Gerald had initiated was absorbing. This wasn't merely an automobile. It was a summons to an utterly different existence than the one I'd become accustomed to, an existence of independence and thrill instead of habit and security. During the ride home with Andrew controlling his SUV and me trailing in my new Audi, I glimpsed myself in the rear reflector. I appeared altered in some way. Still a 71-year-old bereaved woman with gray locks and creases carved by both joy and sorrow. But something fresh gleamed in my eyes, a spark that had lain inactive too long. At home, I positioned the vehicle meticulously in the vacant garage. The area that had sheltered Gerald's cherished endeavor for 15 years now housed mine. The balance didn't escape me. Andrew dawdled in the entryway, unusual reluctance in his stance. "Mom, regarding disposing of the Mustang without informing you." "I should have. Your dad knew you'd sell it." I interjected softly. He harbored no anger. And neither do I. Not any longer. How could he have predicted? I grinned, recalling how thoroughly Gerald had comprehended our son. Far superior to my own understanding. "Your dad perceived individuals distinctly. He recognized you didn't assign the same importance to items as we did." Andrew furrowed his brow mildly. That vehicle held considerable worth. I believed I was executing a wise fiscal choice for the household. "I know," I affirmed. And for the initial time, I genuinely grasped my son's viewpoint. Not necessarily concur with it, but grasp it. But certain things possess worth exceeding their cost. I regarded the Audi, shining in the waning afternoon glow. Your dad's ultimate present wasn't solely an automobile. It was authorization to exhibit bravery. The driving coach's name was Eleanor Hart, a former secondary educator with a mop of white hair, sharp azure eyes, and the comforting poise of someone who had instructed thousands of anxious folks to drive. She reached my doorstep exactly at 9 o'clock the next day, a leather case under one arm and a portable coffee cup in hand. "Mrs. Thompson." She offered her hand with a strong clasp. "I'm Ellie. Your spouse organized my assistance about 3 years past. I've anticipated your summons." "You knew Gerald?" I questioned, welcoming her indoors. "We connected when he visited to ask about sessions customized for senior operators," she detailed, seating herself at my kitchen surface. "He was very particular about your needs. Patience, motivation, and no superiority whatsoever." She beamed. "He portrayed you as prudent but more skilled than she admits." Hearing Gerald's evaluation of me from this unfamiliar person's words triggered a new surge of feeling. Even as illness robbed his tomorrow, he had been arranging for mine with such consideration. "I'm not convinced he was accurate about the skilled part," I admitted. "It's been almost 20 years since I drove consistently." "Well, that's my purpose here," Eleanor responded matter-of-factly. "Driving resembles cycling. The core abilities persist, but your self-assurance requires reconstruction. She unveiled her case, displaying a personalized program. Gerald and I crafted this scheme especially for you. We'll begin with basics in serene districts, then gradually test you with busier avenues, expressways, and ultimately freeway navigation. I examined the elaborate session outline, each meeting thoughtfully built upon the prior. He truly anticipated everything. He trusted in you, Eleanor stated plainly. Now, shall we start with your fresh transport? For the subsequent 2 hours, we remained in my stationary Audi while Eleanor calmly reintroduced me to driving essentials, reflector placement, hidden area vigilance, contemporary protective functions that weren't around when I last drove routinely. She described each switch and option on the complex panel until they started to click. "You're a fast learner," she remarked as I accurately named each feature. "I instructed elementary school for 35 years," I clarified. "I understand following guidance." Instructing demands wit and flexibility, both superb traits for driving, Eleanor observed. "Now let's guide this splendid device around the neighborhood." My hands quivered faintly as I engaged the ignition button. Despite the short drive from the establishment yesterday, I experienced a wave of unease. Eleanor appeared to detect it. "Margaret," she uttered tenderly, "driving involves handling fear, not eradicating it. Even seasoned operators encounter sporadic worry. The distinction is they've mastered navigating with it instead of permitting it to immobilize them." It was precisely the sort of sensible insight Gerald would have valued. I nodded, engaged drive, and carefully departed the curb. We devoted another hour traversing the peaceful lanes of my area, Eleanor serenely directing me through bends, halts, and fundamental actions. By midday, I had accomplished a dozen circuits without mishap. "Outstanding advancement for the first session," she announced as we returned to my entryway. "Tomorrow, we'll extend a little farther, maybe to the retail complex a few miles distant." Following Eleanor's departure, I lingered in the quiet vehicle for several minutes, soaking in the morning's successes. Minor advances surely, but advances regardless. I pondered what Gerald would think of my development, whether he'd feel proud or entertained by my careful method to this venture he'd arranged. As if responding, my phone rang. It was Andrew. "Mom, how did the driving sessions go?" His manner carried a typical curiosity. "They proceeded smoothly," I answered, surprised by his outreach. Andrew seldom inquired unless he required something particular. "My coach is superb." Good, he hesitated clumsily. "Look, I've contemplated everything. The Mustang, Dad's schemes for you. I wondered if I might visit this evening. There's a matter I'd like to address." Interest aroused. I consented. After disconnecting, I found myself in the garage once more, regarding the Audi in the spot where the Mustang had resided for so long. The void still pained, but differently now, less like a severance and more like the poignant shift of periods. I accessed the timber container Carlos had provided, gliding my fingers over Gerald's precise records about the Mustang's revival. Each leaf noted not merely technical specifics, but his ideas and sentiments during the undertaking. One record from about 6 months prior to his death drew my attention. "Physician indicates the therapy isn't succeeding as anticipated. Informed Margaret it's progressing better than foreseen. Don't wish her to fret excessively. Must complete this vehicle. Must conclude Margaret's setups. She's forever feared alteration, my gentle, prudent wife. But she's tougher than she realizes. The Mustang is my bequest to society. A splendid mechanism revived through endurance and attention. But Margaret is my bequest to her own self. A splendid spirit who must uncover her own power. If I've succeeded, selling the Mustang will serve as the spark that ignites her motor." I shut the diary, tears clouding my sight. Gerald had recognized his impending death while penning these lines. Yet his worry had centered on me, on the existence I'd lead without him. Andrew arrived exactly at 6, bearing a beige binder and appearing atypically anxious. After refusing my dinner proposal, he positioned himself at the kitchen surface, the binder set exactly in front of him. "Mom, I must display something to you," he commenced, opening the binder to expose pictures. Numerous shots of the Mustang from diverse perspectives, expertly captured under ideal illumination. I arranged these before the transaction, he described. I figured you might desire them. I glanced up, startled by this unforeseen act of comprehension. That's quite considerate, Andrew, I uttered, meticulously reviewing the elegant pictures that seized every facet of Gerald's creation. There's additional, he proceeded, his tone uncertain. The purchaser? He's an aficionado who focuses on meticulously revived classics. When Carlos recounted the tale behind the vehicle, how Dad dedicated his closing years to restoring it, Andrew halted, apparently grappling with unusual sentiment. The purchaser has proposed access privileges. Access privileges? I repeated. He maintains his assortment in a temperature-regulated exhibition space about 30 miles from here. He indicates you're free to see the Mustang whenever you wish. Andrew pushed a contact card across the surface. His name is Richard Bennett. I've conversed with him already. He's a respectable individual who truly values what Dad achieved with that vehicle. I stared at the card, absorbing this unforeseen turn. Why would you organize this? Andrew gazed downward, toying with the binder's edge in a motion so contrary to his typical assured behavior. Because I'm starting to realize I erred. Not lawfully. As Dad's successor, I possessed full authority to sell the vehicle. He looked up, meeting my gaze straight. But I neglected to account for its meaning to you, what it symbolized. Your dad knew you'd sell it, I uttered kindly. He prepared for it. Yes, but he also knew I'd do it carelessly, Andrew answered with startling self-insight. He knew I'd view a resource, not a heritage. He motioned to the pictures. I'm attempting to improve, Mom. To perceive things more as he did. The confessions so challenging for my logical, sentimentally guarded son stirred me profoundly. It was the most exposed I'd seen Andrew since he was a kid dealing with a disheartening sports match. Your dad would feel proud of you for this, I informed him, placing my hand over his. Andrew cleared his airway, evidently uneasy with the sentimental ground. There's one further matter. I contacted your driving coach today. She believes you're advancing superbly. I lifted my brows, astonished. You phoned Eleanor? He affirmed. I desired to ensure Dad's scheme was being carried out correctly. The entrepreneur in him couldn't resist surfacing even in this instant of bonding. She noted that your final aim is to undertake a nationwide voyage. That's what your dad organized, I verified. Though I'm unsure if I'll ever be prepared for something that bold. For the first time in ages, I witnessed a sincere grin spread over my son's face. When you are, he uttered, I'd like to accompany you. For a portion, at minimum. I think Dad would have desired that. As dusk enveloped us, I comprehended Gerald's ultimate present wasn't solely the Audi or even the voyage he'd organized. It was this instance of true bonding with our son, something I'd nearly abandoned hope of feeling again. 3 weeks into my driving sessions with Eleanor, we confronted our largest hurdle yet, the freeway. I'd dreaded this benchmark since we started. My gut churning at the sheer idea of blending into rapid traffic, managing several lanes, and sustaining expressway velocities. Recall, Eleanor uttered as we neared the entry ramp. The freeway is truly safer than urban driving in numerous aspects. Fewer crossings, no signals, consistent movement. Her serene reasoning did little to calm my pounding heart as I indicated and started speeding along the access lane. The gauge rose, 40, 50, 55, while I nervously scanned my reflectors for a space in the constant flow of vehicles to our left. Solid speed up, Eleanor motivated. Now seek your opening, there, between the Azure car and the pale van. Indicate and shift fluidly when you hit the right speed. I obeyed her guidance, my fingers pale on the wheel as I directed the Audi into the right path of Interstate 95. The feeling of being encircled by automobiles all traveling swiftly was at once horrifying and strangely invigorating. Superb blend, Eleanor praised. Now hold your path and velocity. We'll depart in 5 miles. Those 5 miles turned into a practice in regulated respiration and concentrated focus. With every passing minute, my tight hold on the wheel eased a bit. By the time we exited, I realized I'd been so absorbed in the activity that I'd forgotten to feel scared. How do you feel? Eleanor inquired as we stopped at a break area. Like I've scaled Mount Everest, I confessed, surprised to discover my hands stable as I shifted to park. In a sense, you have, she answered with a perceptive grin. Dread of expressway driving is among the most frequent barriers for resuming operators. You've just overcome a major psychological obstacle. On the return home, using neighborhood paths rather than tackling the freeway again immediately, I found myself considering Gerald's revival of the Mustang. He tackled that intimidating task one tiny element at a time, never daunted by the whole assignment. Perhaps this path he designed for me demanded the same tactic, mile by mile, obstacle by obstacle, steadily reconstructing my assurance as he had reconstructed that vehicle. The next day delivered an unforeseen guest. I was examining the voyage plan Gerald had assembled when the bell rang. I opened it to discover Carlos Mendoza on my stoop clutching a modest bundle. "Mrs. Thompson," he saluted me cordially. "I trust I'm not imposing." I located something else of Gerald's that I believed you should possess. I welcomed him in, intrigued by this fresh occurrence. In my sitting room, Carlos delicately unpacked the bundle to disclose a tiny model automobile. A flawless scaled-down copy of Gerald's Mustang, detailed to the bespoke finish and metallic accents. "Gerald ordered this from a model creator acquaintance of mine," Carlos clarified. "He desired you to have something to recall the actual vehicle by, something that could rest on a ledge and evoke his efforts without occupying a whole garage." I held the model in my hands, admiring the artistry. Every element was ideal. Even the minuscule tag replicated the one Gerald had selected for the original. "It's exquisite," I whispered. "When did he set this up?" "About a month before he departed," Carlos answered tenderly. "He was highly specific about the elements. My acquaintance only completed it lately, which is why I didn't possess it to give you at the establishment." I set the model cautiously on my fireplace shelf where it appeared to fit instantly. A modest but ideal emblem of Gerald's enthusiasm and diligence. "Eleanor informs me you're advancing superbly with your driving," Carlos remarked. I pivoted to him, surprised. "You know Eleanor?" he affirmed. "Gerald presented us when he was establishing your protection network, I guess you could term it. He wished to ensure there were individuals who grasped his schemes for you, individuals who could provide aid when the moment arrived." The disclosure that Gerald had formed not just an automobile and a plan, but a complete web of helpful people to direct me onward was overpowering. While I'd concentrated on his ailment, on easing his last months, he had been silently coordinating this intricate route for my future. "I conquered the freeway yesterday," I informed Carlos, experiencing an odd pride in the feat that's marvelous. His zeal seemed authentic. "Expressway driving is a key achievement." "How did it feel?" "Frightening," I admitted. "Then empowering, then simply operating," Carlos affirmed knowingly. "That's frequently how it unfolds with the matters that scare us most. First they appear unattainable, then they turn into triumphs, and ultimately, they're just part of existence." After Carlos departed, I felt pulled to Gerald's voyage plan again. I laid the charts across the kitchen surface, following the meticulously drawn path with my fingertip. Beginning from our residence in Connecticut, the trip circled westward through Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Illinois before veering south through Missouri and Oklahoma. Then west once more through New Mexico and Arizona, along the California shore, and back east through the northern regions. Each halt was thoroughly organized, not just accommodations and spans, but comments on unique locations, eateries Gerald thought I'd relish, and even optimal times of day to observe certain landmarks. Grand Canyon at dusk, read one comment. "The illumination on the Scarlet Stones is something all should witness once." Had he explored these spots himself? Some maybe during work travels over the years, but most, I suspected he'd investigated specifically for this plan, places he'd hoped we might explore together someday before disease disrupted our intentions. The extent of the trip was intimidating, nearly 8,000 miles altogether, covering about 2 months if I adhered to his recommended rhythm. Could I truly embark on such an escapade solo? The Margaret who had existed 4 weeks prior would have rejected the notion outright. But now I proceeded to my sleeping chamber and accessed the bedside drawer where I stored my most treasured keepsakes. Among them was a modest booklet where Gerald and I had once cataloged things we aspired to do in later years. Opening it now, I located a page headed places to visit jointly in my script, followed by a roster of destinations, many matching the voyage plan: the Grand Canyon, Redwood National Park, the Rocky Mountains, the Pacific Ocean at dusk. I'd penned these desires decades back when later years seemed distant, and nationwide travel a feasible goal for our later phase. Then existence interfered. Gerald's enterprise difficulties in the 90s postponing our savings, my mother's prolonged sickness needing our attention, and ultimately Gerald's disease diagnosis soon after he'd at last retired. Someday had never materialized for us as a pair. But Gerald had guaranteed it could still occur for me. My phone sounded, disrupting these musings. It was Andrew. "Mom, Wendy and I have discussed," he started without introduction. "We'd like you to dine with us this Sunday. There's a vital matter we wish to talk about with you." His manner was indecipherable, neither affectionate nor distant, just resolutely impartial in the style he'd refined in professional dealings. Certainly, I agreed, intrigued by this official request. "Should I contribute anything?" "Just your presence," he answered. "And perhaps your voyage schemes, if you're at ease sharing them." After we disconnected, I positioned myself at the window, surveying the yard Gerald had diligently tended for decades. The rose plants required trimming. Another chore I'd evaded since his passing, uncertain if I could replicate his precise method. "I operated on the freeway today," I declared aloud to the vacant space, picturing Gerald's proud grin. "And I'm contemplating undertaking that trip you organized. Unsure if I'm prepared, but I'm mulling it over." The quiet that responded seemed somehow affirming, as if the very structure of our home retained Gerald's supportive aura. I returned to the kitchen surface, to the charts and plans, and for the first time I started adding my own comments in the edges. Queries, concepts, minor modifications, not overriding Gerald's diligent schemes, but incorporating my own perspective to our ultimate partnership. Sunday dawned with a flawless azure sky that evoked drives Gerald and I used to take on such ideal days. Directionless excursions along rural paths with no goal beyond the delight of motion and togetherness. I opted to drive myself to Andrew and Wendy's outlying residence, a choice that would have appeared impossible merely a month back. Their dwelling was a stylishly refreshed colonial in a select district, striking, but somehow barren with grounds that appeared expertly cared for, but missing individual flourishes. No lopsided bird shelter constructed by a grandparent and grandchild on a summer day. No untamed bloom area permitted to grow a bit wild because the insects favored it that way. I entered their rounded entryway, placing my Audi beside Andrew's Mercedes and Wendy's Range Rover. Inhaling deeply, I assembled the binder holding Gerald's voyage schemes and my additions, wondering why Andrew had specifically requested I bring them. Wendy opened the door with her signature flawless grin, the one that involved her lips, but never fully touched her eyes. At 43, my son's spouse stayed remarkably attractive with accented fair hair, a flawlessly kept physique, and attire that always seemed chosen by a style expert, which I reminded myself it likely was. "Margaret, how delightful to have you." She saluted me with a light peck near each cheek, "and you transported yourself." Andrew noted you'd begun sessions. Her tone bore that subtle hint of superiority she saved for things she deemed charming or outdated. My ongoing stay in the family dwelling, my fondness for penned messages over digital ones, and now evidently my later life driving sessions. "The Audi performs wonderfully," I responded, entering their stone-floored foyer. Gerald selected wisely. A trace of something, irritation, unease, flashed across Wendy's impeccable features at the reference to my husband's after-death present. "Yes, well, Andrew awaits in the meal area. We've ordered from Maurizio's." She guided me through their official lounge, a zone so meticulously arranged it might have been a furnishings display, into the similarly immaculate meal area where Andrew stood by a buffet organizing beverages. "Mom," he saluted me with a clumsy partial embrace. "Pleased you could attend." "Scotch and soda." "Just soda, please," I answered, placing my binder on a table corner. "I'm operating, recall?" A touch of true pride crossed Andrew's face. "Right. Eleanor noted you're advancing superbly." Wendy's brows arched slightly. You're in frequent touch with Margaret's driving coach. I'm supervising Dad's arrangements. Andrew responded with a shrug that didn't fully attain the nonchalance he appeared to seek. The meal continued with the customary courteous chatter, their offspring's successes at their elite academies, Andrew's latest professional triumphs, Wendy's philanthropic group efforts. I had joined these exchanges for years, providing the anticipated replies and suitable appreciation. Today, however, I felt oddly removed, as if watching the act from afar. When had I grown so inactive in my bond with my son and his kin? Had it started when Gerald passed, or sooner? Had I yielded my true self in tiny portions over the years, exchanging real linkage for surface peace? Mom, Andrew's voice intruded my reflections. You appear preoccupied. Apologies, I uttered, placing my utensil down. I was merely pondering how little we truly understand one another. The declaration, unplanned and raw, landed amid the refined table like an unwelcome visitor. Wendy's flawless grin stiffened while Andrew blinked quickly, his standard reaction to sentimental unease. What an odd remark, Wendy chuckled lightly. We've been kin for over 20 years. Yes, I concurred. And yet, I couldn't specify what genuinely matters to either of you beyond exteriors and accomplishments, just as you couldn't identify what mattered most to Gerald or to me. Andrew placed his goblet down with intentional care. Is this concerning the Mustang? I believed we'd progressed beyond that. It's not solely about the vehicle, I uttered kindly. It's about perceiving each other distinctly. Gerald comprehended that you'd sell the Mustang because he grasped your principles. He didn't share them, but he honored your entitlement to them. And you believe we don't honor yours? Andrew's tone grew sharper defensively. I think we've never truly debated them, I responded. We've kept a courteous separation for so long that we've lost the art of genuine dialogues. Wendy fidgeted uncomfortably in her seat. Perhaps this isn't the ideal moment. Actually, Andrew interposed. It's precisely the correct moment. He inhaled deeply, sharing a look with his spouse. That's partially why we invited you this evening. We've been reevaluating some matters. He stood and exited the space briefly, returning with a large design sketch that he carefully spread across the table, securing the edges with condiment holders. This is what we initially envisioned for your garage, he confessed. The elaborate illustration depicted my modest garage converted into a lavish dressing chamber and storage space complete with bespoke shelving, a middle counter, and dedicated areas for footwear, bags, and periodic attire. It would have boosted the estate's worth considerably, Wendy clarified, her digits outlining the graceful layout. The market value would have risen substantially. I see, I uttered, examining the designs without the fury I might have experienced weeks prior. And now Andrew cleared his airway. After all that's occurred, uncovering Dad's present, grasping what he had organized for you. We've held some talks, he glanced at Wendy, who nodded almost unnoticed. We've resolved to abandon the makeover plans. It wasn't merely about a storage area, Wendy supplemented, astonishing me with her frankness. We presumed you'd be disposing of the residence soon, relocating to a senior community or supported facility. The makeover was part of our setup for ultimately marketing the estate. The exposure of their presumptions should have stung, but instead I found it strangely freeing. At least we were at last voicing realities, however awkward. And now I encouraged again. Andrew reached for the binder I'd brought. Now, we desire to learn about this voyage Dad organized, the one you're pondering undertaking. I opened the binder, distributing the charts and plan across the surface. Gerald devoted his closing months designing this nationwide excursion for me. Every path, every pause, every location he believed I should encounter. Wendy leaned in, reviewing the thorough schemes with what seemed authentic curiosity. This is remarkably elaborate. He must have invested countless hours investigating. That was Gerald, I uttered softly, diligent to the finish. And you're seriously contemplating this? Andrew questioned, his tone mixing disbelief and what might have been respect. Alone at your age? In his query, I detected echoes of the practical, safety-aware voice that had always dwelled in my own mind. The voice that had prevented me from many escapades over the decades, the voice Gerald had softly contested throughout our union. I'm not just contemplating it, I uttered, surprising myself with my conviction. I'm executing it. Eleanor thinks I'll be prepared for expressway travel in another month. I intend to launch the excursion in early June when the climate should be perfect across most of the land. Andrew examined me with an expression I couldn't fully decode. You've transformed, he ultimately uttered. Not transformed, I amended him. Rediscovered aspects of myself that have been inactive. Your dad always perceived those aspects even when I didn't. A quiet descended over the table as Andrew and Wendy shared another of those spousal glances that held whole exchanges. We'd like to assist, Andrew at last uttered with the trip setups. Of all the replies I had foreseen, this was perhaps the least anticipated. Why? I inquired straightforwardly. Andrew appeared uneasy, but persisted. Because I've reflected on Dad extensively since we uncovered his setups for you, about what he prized and what he desired for us both. He met my gaze directly. I want to comprehend him better and perhaps by extension comprehend you better, too. For the first time in years, I saw my son, truly saw him, not as the refined, remote executive he had evolved into, but as the multifaceted person he was, someone able to grow and rethink, just as Gerald had trusted. I'd like that, I uttered simply. And as the evening proceeded with Andrew and Wendy posing sincere questions about my driving advancement and travel schemes, I detected something shifting in our family interaction. A subtle but meaningful realignment that Gerald, in his quiet sagacity, might have foreseen all along. 6 weeks after uncovering Gerald's concealed presence, I stood in my entryway at dawn, the Audi loaded for a trip I still couldn't fully accept I was embarking on. Eleanor had declared me prepared after our concluding session the prior day, during which I'd adeptly maneuvered peak-hour freeway traffic with a poise that astonished us both. Recall all we've rehearsed, she'd uttered as we separated. Take regular pauses, remain in the right path when uncertain, and rely on your senses. You're more skilled than you realize, Margaret. Now, as I conducted one final verification of my travel readiness, those words echoed in my thoughts. The rear held a thoughtfully packed valise, crisis supplies Gerald had detailed in his comments, and a modest chiller with supplies for the initial day's travel. The companion seat bore my road guide despite the GPS Gerald had insisted on physical charts as reserve, the diary he'd bequeathed me, and a neck cushion for ease during extended segments. The early air felt infused with potential, the eastern horizon just starting to tint with sunrise. I'd intentionally selected an early exit to evade Andrew and Wendy's proposal of a formal departure, which I suspected would only heighten my anxiety. Instead, I'd bid them farewell the previous night at a remarkably enjoyable meal, where Andrew had gifted me a fresh mobile device for enhanced road safety, he'd explained, already configured with monitoring programs that would let him track my progress remotely. His worry was endearing, if a tad overdone. In the weeks following our revealing Sunday meal, Andrew had immersed himself in my travel readiness with the same systematic thoroughness he applied to work initiatives. He demanded the Audi be maintained again, acquired an expanded roadside aid plan, and even joined my final driving session to evaluate my preparedness, an act that had greatly amused Eleanor. Your son possesses your husband's guarding tendencies, she'd noted later, but not quite his belief in your abilities. That will develop over time. As I locked the residence, verifying fasteners, modifying climate controls, and programming lights, I sensed Gerald's aura strongly, as if he were supervising my exit with approving focus. In the kitchen, I paused before a mounted photo from our 25th milestone. Gerald and me positioned beside a leased open top during our single true getaway, a week-long coastal drive in California that had stayed a treasured recollection. I'm truly doing this, I told his beaming likeness, just as you designed. Outdoors again, I took one last glance at the dwelling we'd shared for 46 years. The morning glow softened its aging traits, emphasizing the personality rather than the deterioration. Andrew had vowed to inspect the property routinely during my absence, and had even organized a landscaping service to tend Gerald's cherished roses, a considerate act that had deeply touched me. With a profound breath, I settled into the operator's seat, adjusted my reflectors, and ignited the motor. The first day's path was fairly direct. West through Connecticut into New York, then south via Pennsylvania toward my starting overnight halt in Harrisburg. Gerald had designed shorter travel days initially, permitting me to build poise gradually. As I departed the curb, a motion in my rear reflector caught my eye. A silhouette stood at the end of my entryway. Arm lifted in adieu, Andrew. Despite my plea for no farewell, he had arrived nonetheless, coming quietly in the before-dawn glow to observe this crucial instant. I slowed, pondering if I should halt, but he shook his head and signaled for me to proceed. Grasping his motion as the regard it was meant to be, I raised my hand in recognition and continued, observing in my reflector as his form diminished until it vanished around the bend. The initial hour passed in a condition of heightened alertness, my hands clutching the wheel firmly as I navigated known local paths toward the expressway. Every junction, every blend demanded conscious effort. But slowly, as the distance grew, I felt a subtle change. My respiration deepened, my shoulders relaxed, and operating became less a drill in focus and more a smooth, innate pursuit. By mid-morning, I had entered New York State, the Audi's fluid control and quick response enhancing my poise with each mile. Traffic grew as I neared denser zones. But the protective techniques Eleanor had ingrained now engaged instinctively, keeping secure distances, scanning reflectors often, predicting other operators' actions. At a break spot just before noon, I contacted Andrew as pledged to update my advancement. "You're maintaining great pace," he uttered, and I could detect the mild surprise in his tone. "How does it feel?" "Freeing," I responded truthfully. I'd overlooked the basic joy of motion, of seeing the terrain shift around you. "Dad would feel proud," Andrew uttered. The words evidently not flowing easily to him. He forever trusted you could accomplish more than you believed feasible. After a short meal and a stroll to loosen my limbs, I proceeded south, entering Pennsylvania in early afternoon. The undulating elevations and cropland offered a picturesque setting as I settled into the cadence of expressway travel. By late afternoon, I had arrived in Harrisburg and successfully directed to the modest inn Gerald had chosen for my first evening. The inn attendant grinned as I registered. "Mrs. Thompson, we've awaited you. Your booking was placed long ago." "Yes," I answered, still astounded by the breadth of Gerald's foresight. "My spouse arranged it." "Well, he selected one of our finest chambers, with river vista, freshly updated, and this was deposited for you several months past." She presented an envelope with my name in Gerald's unique script. In my chamber, I positioned myself by the window overlooking the Susquehanna River and opened the envelope with quivering digits. Inside was a basic card. "My cherished Margaret, if you're perusing this, you finished the first day of your excursion. I knew you could manage it. The initial move is always the toughest. Whether launching a nationwide drive or beginning a fresh phase of existence, I've organized minor surprises at various halts along your path. Nothing fancy, just mementos to inform you I'm with you in essence. The reception has a bundle for you tomorrow. This evening, commemorate your valor. Request in-room dining if fatigued. The fish is superb here. Or wander the waterfront if feeling bold. This excursion is yours now." I've simply proposed the path. With all my affection, Gerald, I pressed the card to my core, overwhelmed with sentiment. Even now, Gerald was directing me ahead while fostering my self-reliance, the ideal equilibrium he had always upheld in our union. After rinsing off the day's travel residue with a lengthy rinse, I astonished myself by selecting exploration over in-room dining. The waterfront was charming in the evening glow, with a strolling trail that provided vistas of the water and the urban outline. I located a modest eatery with exterior seating and savored a relaxed meal observing vessels traverse the river and households amble the walkway. For the first time in 3 years, I felt genuinely vital, not merely surviving in the wake of loss, but actively interacting with the world once more. The feeling was mixed, shaded with consciousness of Gerald's absence, but also brimming with thankfulness for his ultimate present to me, permission and motivation to persist living wholly. Back in my chamber, I accessed the voyage diary and created my initial record, noting not just the functional details of distance covered and paths taken, but my ideas and emotions throughout this significant day. As Gerald had proposed, the world indeed appeared altered from the operator's seat, larger, more reachable, abundant with opportunities one had forgotten were possible. Day 1 finished. I inscribed at the close. I miss you, Gerald, but I sense you with me on this excursion. Thank you for trusting I could achieve this, even when I doubted myself. As I drifted toward slumber, I pondered what surprise awaited me tomorrow, and what fresh challenges and revelations the approaching days would deliver. The dread that had shaped so much of my existence had not vanished completely, but it had been demoted to a rider rather than permitted to stay the operator. Tomorrow would deliver new paths, new encounters, new trials of my expanding poise. For the first time in decades, I found myself anticipating the unfamiliar. The bundle awaiting me at the reception the following morning held a modest, gracefully wrapped case and another message from Gerald. Inside the case was a classic compass in a buffed brass housing, evidently an heirloom, but an ideal operating state for when you need to locate your genuine direction. Gerald's message read, "This was my grandfather's, who employed it to guide his way across the nation during the Great Depression." He instructed me that sometimes the most vital excursions aren't about arriving at a goal, but about uncovering what resides within you during the process. Store it in the storage compartment. Devices fail, but genuine direction stays unchanging. I attached the compass to my keyring, comforted by this concrete link to both Gerald and his lineage. After a substantial morning meal, I reviewed the day's path, a direct westward course across Pennsylvania toward Pittsburgh, where I'd pass my second evening before advancing to Columbus, Ohio the next day. The morning travel was agreeable. Traffic sparse as I left Harrisburg and ventured into the more countryside central region of the state. Undulating elevations yielded to farmland, interrupted by tiny communities that emerged and faded in my rear reflector. I was establishing a comfortable traveling rhythm when a panel alert abruptly lit. Tire pressure caution. My pulse surged briefly, but Eleanor's instruction activated. I carefully lowered speed, scanned my reflectors, and pulled to the roadside. Warning lights flashing. Once securely halted, I contacted the roadside aid service Andrew had demanded I enter into my new device. "Seems you've collected a spike," the specialist told me after arriving and checking the right rear wheel. "Not something you'd want to keep traveling on, particularly for the spans you're intending. I can install your reserve temporarily, but you'll require a proper substitute. Can you suggest somewhere close?" I inquired, checking my GPS. He indicated a small community about 10 miles forward. "Thornfield has a reliable maintenance hub, family-operated, existed for generations. They'll handle you properly." An hour later, I sat in the lounge of Thornfield Auto Service, observing as they fitted a new wheel on my Audi. The postponement was irritating. I'd intended to arrive in Pittsburgh for an early supper and maybe some city exploration Gerald had noted as offering superb evening river vistas. Mrs. Thompson, the facility proprietor, a cordial woman in her 60s named Susan Miller, approached with my forms. "You're ready." We proceeded and rearranged all your wheels while at it. No added fee. "That's a gorgeous transport you're operating." "Thank you," I answered, rising to finalize the transaction. My spouse picked it. "Well, he possesses superb preference," she remarked, guiding me to the counter. "You noted you're traveling nationwide." "Yes," I affirmed, feeling a minor swell of pride at uttering this. "My spouse designed the excursion before he departed." I'm following his plan. Something in my account captured her interest. That's quite remarkable," she uttered, regarding me with renewed attention. "You know, if you don't object to a local tip, there's a picturesque path from here that eventually rejoins the expressway toward Pittsburgh. Takes perhaps an hour more, but it's one of the loveliest drives in the region, traces an ancient rail track through the peaks, past cascades, and some heritage spots." She extracted a chart and outlined the alternate path with her digit. "My late spouse and I used to travel it every fall to view the leaves. Always evoked why we never relocated from Pennsylvania despite ample chances." I hesitated, Gerald's diligently organized plan weighing against this unforeseen proposal. What would he have wanted me to do? Adhere strictly to his schemes or welcome the impromptu chances that journeys often offer? The cascades sound delightful, I found myself uttering, and I'm not in any rush. Susan grinned warmly. That's the proper attitude for an excursion like yours. Sometimes the finest recollections stem from the unforeseen diversions. Equipped with Susan's sketch chart, supplementing my GPS, I embarked on the picturesque path. Nearly at once, I grasped why she had suggested it. The lane twisted through dense woodlands and beside a glittering stream, sporadically surfacing to unveil stunning panoramas of the dale below. Heritage signs dotted the path, narrating tales of early inhabitants, commercial growth, and wartime activities. At Susan's recommendation, I halted at a specific viewpoint where a brief strolling trail led to a grand cascade tumbling down lichen-clad stones. Standing there observing the sunlight form arcs in the spray, I felt an unforeseen sense of unity with Gerald. Not the sorrow-shaded memory that had marked the past 3 years, but something brighter, more joyful, as if we were sharing this splendor together. I extracted my device, still somewhat marveling at how readily I'd adjusted to Andrew's present and captured several images of the falls. On a whim, I sent one to my son with the note, "Unforeseen detour. Sometimes the scenic path merits the extra duration." His reply arrived swiftly. "Stunning. Dad would endorse spontaneity." By the time I reconnected with the primary expressway, I was almost 3 hours delayed from my initial timeline. Pittsburgh would wait until well past dusk. Instead of worry, however, I felt a peculiar freedom. The strict scheduling that had ruled much of my mature life, school signals during my educating career, medical visits during Gerald's ailment, the diligent routine of bereavement, seemed less vital now. I contacted the Pittsburgh Inn to notify them of my delayed arrival and continued westward as afternoon faded into dusk. Operating in darkness had been one of my greatest worries, but Eleanor had demanded night practice during our sessions. Now, with the Audi's superior beams lighting the lane and its guidance system directing me assuredly, I found the encounter not alarming, but serene. When I ultimately reached my inn, it was beyond 10 o'clock. Weary, but strangely vitalized, I registered and discovered another of Gerald's surprises awaiting. A booking at the inn's upper eatery for the next morning's meal, timed ideally to capture what his note described as the most magnificent vista of the 3 rivers merging in dawn light. In my chamber, I accessed the voyage diary again and recorded the day's occurrences, focusing especially on the unforeseen detour and what it had imparted. Today, I learned that adaptability can be as crucial as foresight. I inscribed, "The path Gerald charted is marvelous, but perhaps the greatest present he bestowed was the poise to occasionally create my own trail." As I readied for rest, my device chimed with another message from Andrew. "Tracking indicates you arrived securely. How was the travel?" I paused, then typed, "Challenging in unforeseen ways, beautiful in others." I had a puncture, but managed it. Took a picturesque diversion on local advice. Arrived later than intended, but with no remorse. His response warmed me unexpectedly. "You sound like Dad," he always said. "The best tales come from the unplanned instance." "Rest well, Mom. Proud of you." Andrew had seldom voiced pride in me. Not because he didn't experience it, perhaps, but because our bond had settled into different communication patterns. This simple message dispatched across hundreds of miles felt like another modest bridge being reconstructed between us. As I drifted toward slumber, I found myself contemplating the compass Gerald had given me that morning. "Genuine direction remains unchanging," he had inscribed. I was beginning to comprehend that while sorrow and loss had temporarily disoriented me, my inner compass was gradually readjusting, not to the life I had shared with Gerald, for that was irrevocably altered, but to a new alignment that honored our history while embracing possibilities he had envisioned for me. Tomorrow would bring Pittsburgh's rivers and dawn light, then the crossing into Ohio, my first state boundary as a lone traveler. But tonight, I slept soundly, no longer quite so fearful of the excursion or the uncertain path ahead. Pittsburgh and dawn light was everything Gerald had assured. From the inn's upper eatery, I observed the sun ascend over the meeting of the 3 rivers, the Allegheny and Monongahela uniting to form the Ohio, their waters shimmering gold and bronze in the early glow. Metal spans crossed the waterways like mechanical filigree, while the crystal structures of the center reflected the shifting sky. I lingered over the meal, relishing both the vista and the awareness that I was unhurried. This excursion was not about marking off locations, but about the encounter itself, a lesson I was slowly absorbing after decades of timetable-driven existence. As I prepared to leave, the attendant approached with yet another envelope. "This was deposited for you long ago, Mrs. Thompson," he clarified, "with orders to provide it this morning." Inside was a modest hand-sketched map of Pittsburgh with several sites circled in crimson ink. A note in Gerald's script explained, "These were my preferred locations during work visits to the steel metropolis. The confluence is splendid, but don't overlook the Duquesne Incline for the finest city vista. If time allows, the Carnegie collections merit a few hours." I reviewed the map, then made an impulsive choice. The diligently organized plan had me departing Pittsburgh right after the meal, reaching Columbus by mid-afternoon. But why hasten? This excursion was mine to form, and Gerald's proposals beckoned alluringly. I approached the attendant again. "I'd like to prolong my visit for another evening, if feasible." "Certainly, Mrs. Thompson." Your spouse actually booked the chamber for 2 evenings initially, with a note that you might choose to remain longer. His grin suggested this wasn't the first of Gerald's arrangements he had enabled. The revelation that Gerald had anticipated my possible wish for flexibility touched me profoundly. He had known me so well, not just the cautious, schedule-focused woman I had been for most of our union, but the more adventurous essence he had always believed lurked beneath my careful surface. I spent the day exploring Pittsburgh through Gerald's perspective, visiting each site he had marked. At the confluence where the rivers met, I sat on a bench observing vessels navigate the flows while youngsters played in the adjacent fountain. The Duquesne Incline, a century-old funicular that ascended Mount Washington, provided breathtaking sweeping views of the city below, and the Carnegie collections filled my afternoon with treasures of creativity and natural legacy. At each halt, I found myself imagining Gerald there, his insights, his appreciation for both mechanical wonders and natural splendor. It felt less like following a manual and more like sharing encounters across the divide that separated us. That evening, I contacted Andrew to inform him of my altered schemes. "You're staying an extra day?" he questioned, surprise clear in his tone. "What about the plan?" "The plan is a proposal, not a command," I responded, surprising myself with the assurance in my voice. "Your dad organized this excursion as a present, not a task. I'm discovering that sometimes it feels right to linger." A pause, then that resonates. Dad was never strict about schemes. That was always more. He faded. More my inclination. I completed for him. "Yes, I know. I'm learning to be more adaptable." "It fits you," he uttered quietly. "Wendy noted that your messages sound different, more engaged," she said. The observation startled me. I hadn't realized my written exchanges reflected the inner changes I was undergoing. Engaged is a fitting term for it. I acknowledged for years after your dad passed. I think I was just subsisting, not really existing. This excursion is altering that. After our exchange, I found myself reflecting on boundaries. Not just the state borders I was crossing on this excursion, but the less tangible ones I had imposed on myself throughout existence. Boundaries between security and hazard, between habit and thrill, between the woman I had been with Gerald and the woman I might become without him. The next morning, I resumed my westward excursion, entering Ohio around noon. The state grading marker prompted an unexpected surge of feeling, a sense of achievement mingled with exhilaration. I pulled into the greeting hub and asked a fellow voyager to capture my image beside the Welcome to Ohio marker, sending it immediately to Andrew with the caption state number to achieved. His response made me chuckle aloud. "Only 46 more to achieve." Jesting. "Unless you're planning to include Alaska and Hawaii on this excursion, too." The playful message revealed yet another boundary being crossed, the formal, somewhat distant bond between Andrew and me gradually yielding to something warmer, more authentic. Columbus provided another surprise, though not one Gerald had arranged. As I registered at my inn, a heritage property in the center that Gerald had chosen for its structural importance. The desk attendant handed me my access with a curious look. "You're Margaret Thompson. We have a communication for you." She passed an envelope. Not Gerald's script this time, but Andrew's exact writing. Inside was a voucher to a nearby wellness center with a note. "Wendy proposed you might relish some indulgence after several days traveling. The inn attendant can organize transport if you don't wish to drive. Contact when you receive this, Andrew." Moved by this considerate act, I called my son right away. "How did you know where to deliver it?" I questioned after expressing thanks. "Dad's plan," he clarified. "I've been examining it, trying to grasp his reasoning better." The Columbus in booking stood out because he'd inscribed a special comment about its heritage design. "Thought you might value something relaxing after all that operating." "It's ideal," I assured him. "But I'm curious why the sudden interest in comprehending your dad's planning." A long pause ensued before Andrew answered, his tone unusually tentative. "I've been perusing his diary, the one about the Mustang revival that you shared with me. There's more of him in those pages than I anticipated. More profundity, more thought for details most would ignore." "That was Gerald," I uttered softly, always noticing the things others overlooked, including things about me. Andrew continued, his tone tightening slightly. "There are records where he discusses my visits, observations about my profession choices, my union. He perceived things I never realized he noticed." The openness in my son's tone moved me deeply. "Your dad was enormously proud of you," I told him, "even when he didn't completely comprehend your choices." "I recognize that now," Andrew answered. "But I'm realizing how little I knew him, really knew him. Beyond the surface role of father, his perception struck a chord. How many of us truly know our parents as complete individuals with aspirations, fears, and inner existences separate from their parental duties? And how many parents permit themselves to be fully known? Perhaps that's something we could pursue together," I proposed. "Getting to know Gerald better even now, and in the process, maybe understanding ourselves more clearly, too." "I'd like that," Andrew uttered with a warmth that reminded me suddenly, painfully, of his dad. After our call, I took full advantage of the wellness voucher, indulging in treatments that eased the bodily strain of days behind the wheel. As I relaxed into a rub-down, I found myself contemplating the developing nature of my bond with Andrew. Another unforeseen present emerging from this excursion. That evening, wandering Columbus on foot, I encountered a modest bookshop cafe with a notice promoting an author presentation. On impulse, I entered, finding a cozy zone filled with a diverse group of individuals. The highlighted author was discussing her personal account about reconstructing her existence after losing her companion of 30 years. I located a seat in the rear, requested tea, and listened as she recited sections describing her struggle to redefine herself without the person who had been her foundation for most of her adult existence. Her words resonated powerfully, expressing emotions I had felt but never fully voiced. During the inquiry segment, I surprised myself by lifting my hand. When selected, I heard myself asking, "How did you know when you were ready to build a new existence rather than just enduring the loss of your old one?" The author grinned tenderly. "I don't think we ever know in any absolute way. But for me, the shift occurred when I realized I was making decisions based on what might bring me happiness in the now rather than what would cause the least suffering or interference to recollections of the past." Her reply lingered with me as I strolled back to my inn through lanes vibrant with the evening vigor of a lively metropolis. Was that what I was doing now? Making choices based on possible joy rather than minimal pain. The very fact that I was pondering such questions felt meaningful. Another boundary crossed, from mere survival to genuine living. In my inn chamber, I opened the excursion diary and made a longer record than usual, reflecting not just on the day's encounters, but on the inner excursion that was unfolding alongside the physical one. I am crossing state borders and personal limits daily. Now, I inscribed, each mile seems to create more separation, not just from home, but from the restricted version of myself I accepted for too long. Gerald knew this would happen somehow. He knew that physical motion would spark emotional and mental drive as well. As I shut the diary, my device chimed with a text from an unfamiliar number. Opening it, I found an image of the Mustang shining under expert illumination in what appeared to be a private assortment exhibition. The message read, "Mrs. Thompson, Carlos Mendoza provided your contact. Thought you might like to see that your spouse's creation has found a fine residence. You're welcome to visit whenever. Richard Bennett." I examined the picture, expecting to feel a renewed sense of forfeiture. Instead, I found myself appreciating the beauty of Gerald's labor and feeling thankful that it was being prized by someone who grasped its importance. Another boundary crossed, from ownership to admiration, from forfeiture to thankfulness. Tomorrow would bring more distance, more state borders, more revelations. But tonight, in a Heritage Inn in Columbus, Ohio, I felt myself becoming someone fresh, while simultaneously reconnecting with parts of myself long overlooked. A contradiction Gerald might have valued and perhaps had even foreseen when designing this excursion of rediscovery. For weeks and nearly 5,000 miles into my nationwide excursion, I stood at the rim of the Grand Canyon as sunset colored the layered stones in tones of honey, scarlet, and gold. Gerald's plan had timed my arrival flawlessly. The canyon at dusk was indeed, as his comments had assured, something everyone should witness once in their lifetime, my arrival. In my thoughts, Gerald had become my travel partner. His aura felt in every thoughtfully organized detail and in the intervals between them where I'd made my own decisions. His voice seemed to murmur in the breathtaking panoramas he'd chosen, in the eccentric roadside draws he'd marked with stars in his comments, "Definitely merits a brief diversion," and in the serene moments of contemplation his excursion had incorporated into my days. I was not the same woman who had stood immobilized in an empty garage 6 weeks prior. That Margaret had been shaped by prudence and habit, by grief's familiar limits. This Margaret bronzed from afternoons wandering national preserves, assured behind the wheel on peak lanes and urban freeways alike, able to initiate talks with unknowns in cafes and guest hubs, was someone both novel and oddly known, as if I'd rediscovered a self that had been dormant. My device rang, interrupting my musing on the immense gorge before me. Andrew's name displayed on the screen. "I just observed the sunset at the Grand Canyon," I told him without prelude. "I know," he answered, surprising me. "Your position updated on the monitoring app." "How is it indescribable?" I uttered truthfully. "Images don't capture it. The profundity, the hues, the pure magnitude of it. It makes you feel at once trivial and deeply vital." "Dad always aspired to see it," Andrew uttered quietly. "It was on his wish list." "Mine, too," I acknowledged. We kept saying one day until one day expired. A comfortable quiet extended between us, the sort that had seldom existed in our bond before this excursion. "Actually, that's partially why I'm contacting," Andrew eventually continued. "Wendy and I have discussed. We'd like to join you for the final week of your excursion, meet you in San Francisco, and travel the Pacific Coast Path portion together. If that wouldn't interfere with your encounter too much." The request astonished me. Andrew taking leave from his demanding profession. Wendy willingly starting a road excursion rather than a lavish retreat holiday. This was unprecedented. "I'd adore that," I uttered, meaning it. "Your dad would too. He always hoped we might voyage together as kin one day." "Well, one day is evidently now," Andrew answered, echoing my prior words with an audible grin. "We've reserved flights for next Wednesday. I've been studying Dad's path for the shore portion. It looks spectacular." After we concluded the call, I stayed at the canyon edge as twilight deepened into night, and stars emerged in unbelievable abundance above the shadowy abyss. Gerald had noted this, too. Linger after dusk for the stars. No urban illumination to reduce them. Like gazing into infinity. The next morning brought a call from an unforeseen source. Richard Bennett, the aficionado who had acquired the Mustang. "Mrs. Thompson," his cordial voice saluted me. "I hope I'm not imposing. Carlos noted you were on a nationwide excursion, and I've been tracking your advancement through the images you've sent him." I had indeed been sharing sporadic pictures with Carlos, who had become a sort of distant supporter for my venture. "Not imposing at all, Mr. Bennett," I assured him. "How is the Mustang?" "Splendid. It's the focal point of my assortment now. Your spouse's skill was exceptional." He paused momentarily. "Actually, I'm contacting because I'm organizing a vintage automobile display at my residence in Monterey next month." The Mustang will be highlighted prominently, and I wondered if you might consider attending as my honored guest. I'd love to have you discuss Gerald's revival process. Monterey was on my shore path, one of the closing halts before San Francisco. The schedule would align perfectly. I'd be privileged, I answered, surprised by how appropriate it felt. Gerald would have relished knowing his labor was being valued by fellow aficionados. Marvelous. I'll have my aide send you the details. Another pause. And Mrs. Thompson, Carlos informed me about the excursion your spouse organized for you. I lost my spouse 5 years past, so I comprehend something of the route you're traversing. It's motivating to see how you're honoring your spouse's ultimate present. The exchange left me thoughtful as I continued my westward excursion. Over the following days, as I crossed the Mojave Wasteland into California, I found myself reflecting on the unforeseen connections this trip had nurtured, with strangers who became brief companions, with my increasingly supportive son. With the memory of Gerald transformed from a source of anguish to a fountain of fortitude. By the time Andrew and Wendy joined me in San Francisco, I had traversed peaks and wastelands, navigated bustling metropolises and drowsy hamlets, and discovered a tenacity I had forgotten I owned. The woman who welcomed them at the airfield bore little similarity to the stunned widow who had stood in an empty garage 7 weeks prior. "Mom, you look..." Andrew seemed lost for words as he embraced me. "Vital," Wendy supplied, regarding me with authentic warmth. "You look vital." The short drive with Andrew and Wendy proved the ideal close to my excursion. To my surprise, they adjusted easily to the leisurely pace I had embraced, halting for spontaneous explorations of shores and overlooks, lingering over meals at coastal eateries Gerald had marked in his comments, and engaging in discussions deeper than any we had shared in years. One evening, as we observed the sunset from a bluffside eatery in Big Sur, Andrew lifted his goblet in tribute. "To Dad," he uttered, his tone heavy with feeling. "For granting us all another opportunity." "To Gerald," I echoed, tapping my goblet against his, who perceived possibilities where others saw conclusions. On our final day, we detoured to Monterey for Richard Bennett's display. The Mustang shone under ideal illumination, encircled by appreciative aficionados who listened intently as I shared tales of Gerald's meticulous revival process. The vehicle that had once been such a source of sorrow had transformed into a channel for linkage and remembrance. Another of Gerald's carefully coordinated presents. As we completed the closing miles of my excursion, returning to the same Connecticut entryway where it had launched nearly 2 months prior, I felt a curious blend of fulfillment and expectation. This specific loop was closing, but others were opening ahead. Andrew assisted with my baggage indoors, while Wendy marveled over the yard, which the service had maintained beautifully during my absence. "Will you remain the night?" I questioned them, suddenly reluctant to be solitary in the dwelling that had been vacant for so long. Actually, Andrew shared looks with his spouse. "We hope to stay the weekend if that's acceptable. There's something we'd like to discuss with you." Over supper prepared jointly in the kitchen where Gerald had once tossed Sunday flapjacks with style, they shared their suggestion. "We've been contemplating," Andrew started cautiously, "about your dwelling." This dwelling, I stiffened slightly, recalling their earlier presumptions about my selling and relocating to supported living. "Not about you disposing of it," he swiftly clarified, reading my look. "About us passing more time here with you. Our youngsters scarcely know this place or the community where their dad matured," Wendy added. "And they've missed truly knowing you. We thought perhaps routine weekend stays, school breaks, if you'd welcome that sort of presence in your existence." The proposal brought tears to my eyes. Another boundary crossed. Another loop fulfilling itself. "I would welcome that very much," I uttered simply. Later that night, after Andrew and Wendy had withdrawn to the visitor chamber, I stood in the garage beside my Audi, now dusty from thousands of miles of American lanes. The space no longer felt barren without the Mustang. Instead, it seemed brimming with potential, a starting point rather than an emptiness. On a whim, I opened the excursion diary and added a concluding record. "Gerald, I finished the excursion you designed. Not precisely as you mapped it, but in the essence you intended. I've crossed state borders and personal limits. I've witnessed sunsets and sunrises from places I never dreamed I'd visit. I've reconnected with our sun and uncovered strengths within myself I had forgotten existed. But the greatest revelation has been that conclusions can hold beginnings. The barren garage that initiated this excursion wasn't truly barren at all. It was filled with the room needed for something fresh to arise. You knew this, naturally. You always perceived the path ahead more distinctly than I did. I still miss you every day. I suspect I always will. But missing you no longer means fearing to advance. The compass you bestowed points genuine direction, and I'm no longer afraid to follow where it guides. Thank you for my ultimate driving instruction, my love, teaching me how to navigate existence without you while carrying you always in my heart. I shut the diary and placed it on the modest shelf beside Gerald's model Mustang. Two concrete reminders of a love that had transcended forfeiture and an excursion that had transformed sorrow into thankfulness. Tomorrow would bring new lanes to explore, new choices to make. But tonight, in the serenity of a dwelling filled once more with kin, I felt Gerald's aura not as a specter of the past, but as a glow illuminating the way forward. The loop was complete, and in its fulfillment, a spiral had begun, carrying me onward into whatever escapades awaited an aging woman who had discovered at 71 that valor was still feasible and that existence could offer fresh starts, even after the most painful conclusions.